Religion 230, Week 9 Lecture, Late Medieval Church. The 14th and 15th centuries are significant on their own for religious developments, successes, and problems. But since we are looking at this time period from the vantage point of some centuries later, it is important to focus on the people and events that make sense of the major cataclysm that was coming to the Church in the 16th century, which was finally the age of reformations. Today's lecture will be focusing on the factors in this time period that led, it seems inevitably, to the major life-changing event of the Protestant Reformation. One of the main factors behind all the reform movements of the 15th and 16th centuries was anti-clericalism. This feeling, shared by many people, was that corruption, both personal and institutional, had infected the Church and pretty much everybody who worked within it, from the Pope and the bishops down to the local priests, monks, and nuns. Some of this criticism was undoubtedly well-deserved. As we saw last week, the track record of the popes in the 14th through 15th centuries was pretty bad. After the Avignon papacy, the Great Western Schism of 1378 to 1417, when there were first 2 and then 3 rival popes, represents the true low point of the papacy. It was only solved by diplomacy and maneuvering, and the rise of what is known as conciliarism, a reform movement that held that supreme authority in the Church resided with an ecumenical council, apart from, or even against, the Pope. The solution to the papal schism was finally provided at the Council of Constance, which met from 1414 to 1418, after the failure of the Council of Pisa in 1409. Constance provided for the election of Martin IV in 1417, now the one and only Pope, although the other 3 were not totally convinced of this. Unfortunately, once Martin became Pope and left the successful council, he was unwilling to call regular councils, as the bishops at Constance had demanded, thus asserting a practical superiority of Pope over councils. Councils had to be called and gathered by a willing administrator, whereas a pope was always a pope. Despite the obvious drawbacks, however, people now generally believed that a council was a solution to the Church problems in need of reform. Martin did finally call a big council in Basel in 1431, just a few weeks before he died, and it tried to deal with further issues related to papal authority and to the Hussite controversy, which had been greatly exacerbated by the execution of Czech reformer Jan Hus, who had been given a safe passage to the council in Constance, but then was declared a heretic and was executed. The majority of the Hussites, who were his followers, were interested in removing at least some of the power, especially political and financial power, of the clergy, and putting some control back in the hands of lay people. They wanted freedom to choose their own ministers who would preach the gospel. They wanted to receive both the bread and the wine at communion, and wine was almost universally withheld from lay people by this point in time. There are many reasons for that, but the basic teaching of the Church, which is still the way it's taught today, is that the full benefit of the Eucharist is available in each element, in either the bread or the wine, so just eating the bread is enough. But after Vatican II, generally speaking, people today take both, because that is, in fact, the full form of the sacrament is in both bread and wine. But if you can only take one for some reason, then you still get the full benefit. They also wanted the clergy to embrace poverty and not let one's clerical or social status excuse one from punishment for sins. These criticisms were pretty widespread in the Church of the 15th century, and certainly were picked up again in the 16th century Protestant Reformation. But political machinations, largely from the Pope, brought this council to an end in 1449, with the Pope and the Curia having regained their supremacy over councils. In fact, Pope Pius II, who reigned from 1458 to 64, issued a statement which prohibited appealing to a council over a pope. The theory of conciliarism remained alive, but they were fighting an uphill battle. Now, when popes were not avoiding councils, they were largely engaged with the Renaissance, a movement at first largely within the spheres of literature and art, and focusing on the recovery of classic Greek and Roman forms. But it expanded, especially through humanism, which was a particular focus on human achievement, along with the recovery of classical languages and thought, and turning away from scholasticism. So there was humanism, and that allowed the Renaissance to become a movement also concerned with politics, economics, theology, education, and society in general. One example of a humanist figure who had wide influence on the church was Lorenzo Valla, who lived from 1407 to 1457. Valla was a Roman priest and teacher who was especially a philologist, and that is someone who studies languages and its development in literary sources. His two big accomplishments were that he discovered that the supposedly 4th century donation of Constantine was fake. And of course, that actually brought into question many of the claims about the authority of the papacy. And he also wrote a comparison of the Latin Vulgate New Testament, which of course was the text of the Bible that had been used by the church for 1,000 years, since Jerome translated it in about the year 400. So he compared the Latin Vulgate text of the New Testament with the Greek New Testament, which was considered to be more the original text, and he pointed out that there were many errors and inaccuracies in the translation. Now, this book was not actually published until 1505, when Erasmus discovered it, but at that point it had a huge impact on church, on theology, on the Reformation, on lots of things, on scholarship. Like Valla, humanists in general were interested in reform of society, of education, of the church, and of secular government. And they worked to bring that about, even while the popes of this period were more interested in taking part in the Renaissance revival of beautiful art and architecture. And you can see here this particular pope with his 4 nephews, who were all in fact cardinals of the church, and that actually represents a very common office in the church of the cardinal nephew, which really represents the nepotism in the church at this time. And nepotism is when you give an office or a job to somebody because they're related to you or they're your friend, not because they're the best candidate for the job. So obviously nepotism was a big issue in the Renaissance papacy. So the famous Sistine Chapel was restored in the 1470s under Pope Sixtus IV, and St. Peter's Basilica was commissioned by Julius II in the early 1500s. And these are the sorts of things that the classic Renaissance popes were more concerned with. A related discovery that amplified the importance of the humanist movement and the general push for reform in the 16th century is the new printing press created by Johannes Gutenberg around the year 1450. The new technology of printing, which quickly spread throughout Europe to all major cities and many towns, greatly expanded what was available in print and stimulated, at least over time, the interest in learning to read. Although humanists and reformers in general were scathing in their critiques of the clergy, who they largely saw as ignorant and ill-equipped to undertake the care of any souls, there were some important religious movements that were well received and respected. One was German mysticism, that was especially associated with a Dominican priest named Meister Eckhart. Eckhart preached about the interior life, the desire to become closer to God through a mystical union. He focused on prayer and individual devotion, rather than the sacraments and church worship. So he was often viewed with suspicion. In fact, his archbishop accused him of heresy. Another individual who was seeking a deeper religious experience in life was Gerhard Groot, who gave up on an academic career to devote himself to a simple life as a missionary preacher. He also got into trouble, but died of the plague before he could be tried for anything. He had gathered a group of people around him who adopted a semi-monastic form of life that became known as the Brethren of the Common Life. They took no solemn vows, as monks did, but supported each other in fulfilling their vocations. They set up free schools in Germany and the Netherlands, and so had a wide influence. One of the more famous students at the school in Deventer was Thomas à Kempis. He eventually became a priest, and is most well known for his work, The Imitation of Christ, which was written around 1420. And this is one of the most influential spiritual works of all time, translated into nearly 100 languages and published in over 3,000 editions. The idea of the book is to follow Christ's actions and teachings as closely as possible, seeking perfection, inner peace of mind, and humility. It stresses the need for self-control and true repentance, and in a common theme for a time that frequently saw death from plague and war. The Black Death killed probably about a third of the population of Europe in the years 1346 to 1343, and the many wars of the time killed almost as many. This book has a long meditation on death and the coming judgment that we will all face, along with the suffering in this life and our need to rely on God's grace. Now, not all mystics were men. In fact, this was an aspect of religious life in which women succeeded and gained fame just as often or even more than men. A good example is Julian of Norwich. She was an anchoress, that is, someone who lives locked away from others, so a hermit, but usually locked into a room or a space, often attached to a church building. That's what Julian did. She was basically walled into a little closet area on the side of the church in Norwich. And she is the first known woman to write a book in English. Her book, The Revelations of Divine Love, recounts the visions she received, usually of Christ and his passion, while she was ill. These mystical tendencies were frequently seen as, and probably were, an attempt to gain a relationship with God outside of the church, or at the very least, outside of the authority of the clergy, who controlled more or less the sacraments, the liturgy, masses, etc. And these were, in fact, becoming further and further away from a participatory event for lay people, and more something which they simply observed. In fact, private masses, a late medieval development, and often something people would pay for to help dead relatives escape purgatory, were spoken away from the people by priests alone, some of whom did nothing else. In fact, it was the system of penance, and in particular the practice of selling indulgences, that we need to look at next, because it was the tinder that set alight the Reformation of the 16th century.